The morning Alberta Langston spread her hand-drawn contract across the scarred surface of the Silver Spur Saloon's corner table, every man in the room thought she had lost her mind. Every man except the one she had come specifically to find. The year was 1878, and the town of Calhoun Creek, Texas, sat baked and dry under a sun that showed no mercy to the living. It was a town of dust and ambition and broken promises, perched on the edge of the Llano Estacado like a man leaning too far over a cliff, not yet falling but not entirely safe either. The railroad had come through 3 years prior, and with it had come merchants and swindlers and dreamers, all of them chasing the particular Western promise that land could be made to yield something worth having if you pushed it hard enough. Alberta had been pushing hard her whole life. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned severely beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades, and eyes the particular shade of green that seemed to shift between sage and storm depending on her mood. She was not a small woman, though she was not large either. She was the kind of woman who took up exactly the space she needed, and not 1 inch more, and who made you feel somehow that the space she occupied was more important than the space you were standing in. She wore a practical riding skirt of dark brown wool, a white shirtwaist buttoned to the throat, and boots that had been resoled twice and still wanted resoling again. She had inherited the Langston Ranch, 4,000 acres of semi-arid grassland along the banks of the Sweetwater Creek tributary, from her father, who had died of a fever the previous November without leaving behind anything resembling a plan. What he had left behind, besides the land itself, was a cattle herd that had dwindled to 63 head, a water well that was getting shallow, a barn that needed a new roof, and a debt to the Calhoun Creek savings and loan that came due in exactly 4 months. Alberta had done the arithmetic repeatedly. She needed to trail those 63 head to Abilene, sell them at market, purchase more stock, improve the ranch's water situation, and show the bank enough activity that they would consider extending her loan. She needed a partner with cattle knowledge, trail experience, and some capital. She needed someone who would take her seriously as a landowner and not spend half his time trying to convince her that the sensible thing was simply to sell. She had heard about Abraham Lawson. Abraham Lawson came into the Silver Spur Saloon at 11 minutes past 10 on that Tuesday morning in April, and even Alberta, who had prepared herself for this meeting with the kind of focused practicality that she applied to every difficult task, felt something unexpected shift in the geography of the room when he walked through the door. He was 31 years old, and he looked like someone who had been assembled by the landscape itself, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual work rather than mere youth, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of a worn canvas shirt, and a jaw that had last been clean-shaven perhaps 4 days ago. He had storm-gray eyes that moved quickly and settled slowly, the eyes of a man who made assessments before he committed to positions. His hat was good quality, which told you he was not without means. His boots were scuffed, which told you he actually wore them. He had come to Calhoun Creek 6 months earlier to look at a piece of land north of town, and had stayed because the land turned out to be worth staying for. He had a modest spread of his own 1,200 acres and a herd of roughly 200 head, longhorns mostly, with some Herefords he was experimenting with. He had made 2 drives up to Abilene and had come back from both with enough money to reinvest. He was the kind of man the town respected without fully understanding, which was usually the best kind of man to be in a place like Calhoun Creek. He saw her immediately. It would have been impossible not to. She was sitting alone at a corner table with a piece of paper laid out before her like a general with a battle map, and she was looking directly at the door as if she had been waiting for something specific to walk through it. He walked over, because whatever else Abraham Lawson was, he was not a man who pretended not to notice things. "Miss Langston," he said, pulling out the chair across from her without being invited, which told her immediately that he was not going to be simple to manage. "I was told you wanted a word. I sent you a message asking if you could spare 30 minutes, she said. "I appreciate that you came. Your message said it was business," he said. "I generally make time for business." "Then let us get directly to it," she said, and she pushed the paper across the table toward him. He picked it up. He read it carefully, and she gave him the time to read it because she was not the kind of woman who explained things while people were still reading. The saloon was mostly empty at this hour, a bartender wiping glasses at the far end of the room, two older men playing cards near the window, a young woman sweeping the floor near the stairs. The smell was of old wood and spilled whiskey, and the particular dusty sweetness of hay that always seemed to follow the working people of Calhoun Creek indoors. What Abraham was reading was a partnership agreement. It was written in Alberta's precise, forward-slanting hand, and it laid out the following terms with the kind of clarity that came from someone who had thought about nothing else for the better part of a month. 1. Alberta Langston would contribute the use of the Langston Ranch property, including water rights, grazing land, and existing structures, as the operational base of the partnership. 2. Abraham Lawson would contribute his knowledge of the cattle drive trails, his existing relationships with buyers in Abilene, and a sum of capital. She had left the specific figure blank, with a note indicating it was negotiable toward the purchase of additional cattle to supplement her existing herd. 3. The two parties would trail the combined herd to Abilene together in the coming month, taking advantage of the spring market. 4. Profits would be split 60-40, with 60% going to Alberta, in recognition of the fact that the land and water rights represented the primary long-term asset. 5. The partnership would last a period of 1 year, renewable by mutual agreement, during which time neither party would enter into a competing arrangement without the prior consent of the other. 6. If the partnership dissolved, the land and all improvements to it remained solely with Alberta Langston, and the cattle herd would be divided proportionally based on each party's original contribution. Abraham set the paper down and looked at her across the table. He had a particular expression that she would come to know very well in the months ahead, a kind of considering stillness, as if he was running the numbers in his head while simultaneously deciding what kind of person he was looking at. "The 60-40 split," he said, "is fair," she said, without inflection. "I was going to say I agree with it," he said. She had prepared herself for negotiation, and his agreement caught her slightly off balance, which she did not allow to show on her face. "Good," she said. "The capital contribution," he said, looking at the blank line. "What are you thinking?" $300, she said. "Which would allow us to purchase 20 to 25 additional head at current prices, depending on quality. Combined with my 63, we would trail roughly 85 to 90 head, which alongside your 200 gives us a respectable drive of close to 300 cattle." $300 is significant, he said. "I know it is," she said. "If it's too much, I didn't say that." He leaned back in his chair and studied the ceiling for a moment. A gesture she would later understand was him doing mathematics, not avoiding the conversation. 300 at current Abilene prices, assuming the market holds, yields you a return of, what are you projecting? Conservatively, $18 per head at market. On the whole drive, that's north of $5,000 total. Your 60% of that minus expenses comes out to somewhere around $1,800 after everything. And you'd clear roughly $1,200, he said. Plus the land improves in value simply by demonstrating it's operational. Which matters more to me than the money itself, she said. I have a loan coming due to the savings and loan. I heard your father passed last fall, he said, and his voice changed slightly when he said it, not softer exactly, but differently textured, as if he was careful with the subject. I'm sorry for that. Thank you, she said, in the tone that said she had accepted condolences enough times to know how to receive them without being undone by them. He was a good man who was better at ranching than he was at finances. I intend to be better at both. Abraham picked up the paper again and read through it once more. Then he set it down and looked at her directly. "I have one amendment to propose," he said. She kept her expression neutral. "Go ahead." "The trail drive. You wrote that we would trail together, but you didn't specify what that means in terms of responsibilities. I want it explicitly stated that you have equal authority over decisions during the drive. Not advisory. Equal." She studied him for a long moment. In her experience, men who appeared to give women authority over things generally did so with an asterisk. The authority lasted exactly as long as the woman agreed with what the man had already decided. "You would actually honor that," she said. "I wouldn't put it in writing if I wouldn't," he said. "And I'll tell you why. I have done 2 drives, and both times I have found that the best decisions get made when the people making them are actually paying attention to what's in front of them rather than who's supposed to be in charge. You know this land better than I do. You know this herd. I know the trail. Between the 2 of us, we should be able to manage just fine without me making a single decision by myself." Alberta looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the saloon's front window at a low angle, catching the dust motes in the air and making the whole room look like something from an illustrated newspaper. Outside, she could hear a wagon going by and someone calling to someone else about a delivery of fence posts. "All right," she said. She pulled the paper back, wrote in his amendment in a clear hand, added the capital figure of $300 and pushed it back across to him. "Do you want to think it over, or shall we shake on it now?" "Now," he said, and he extended his hand across the table. His hand was large and warm and calloused in exactly the places that said he was not pretending to be a working man. He actually was one. She shook it firmly, the way her father had taught her, and the deal was made. She did not notice at the time that he held her hand exactly 1 moment longer than was strictly necessary for a business handshake. Later, she would wonder if she had noticed and simply not permitted herself to acknowledge it. But that was later. In that moment, she was thinking about cattle and water rights and the number of weeks she had before the bank came calling. They met again the following morning at the Langston ranch, and it was the first time Abraham had seen the property in daylight. He rode in on a good bay horse named Cassidy, which she noticed and approved of. A man's horse told you a great deal about him. He circled the yard slowly, taking in the barn with its sagging roofline, the well with its hand-cranked pump, the main house which was solid enough though wanting paint, and the pasture fence that had been patched in so many places it had the appearance of something improvised rather than planned. "The well," he said, when he had dismounted and walked over to her where she stood by the fence. "How deep?" 32 feet and getting shallow," she said. "My father drilled it 11 years ago. We've had 2 dry summers in a row." "There's water," he said. "I looked at the geological survey when I was deciding on my own land. The aquifer runs under most of this county, you just have to get to it. But that's for later. First things first." "First things first," she agreed. They walked the property together that morning, all the way out to where the 63 head were grazing on the eastern pasture. They were longhorns mostly, with a few mixed animals that her father had bought at various times from various people, without a great deal of systematic thinking. They were lean from the winter but not unhealthy, and as Alberta moved among them with the ease of long familiarity, calling out particular animals by their markings and noting which ones needed watching, Abraham found himself watching her rather than the cattle. He was not a man given to impulse. He had been engaged once, several years ago, to a woman in Dallas, and it had ended quietly and without drama when they had both come to understand that they wanted different things. She had wanted a man who would stay in one place, and Abraham had not yet been ready to stay anywhere. He had thought about it occasionally since, in the way that a man who has made a decision thinks about the road not taken, not with regret exactly, but with the occasional curiosity of wondering whether things would have gone differently if he had been a different version of himself. He had assumed, in a vague and uncommitted way, that he would eventually settle into something with someone, when the settling felt right. He had not expected it to feel like this. A woman he had known for less than 24 hours, walking through a cattle pasture in the Texas morning with her hat pushed back and her sleeves rolled up, explaining the lineage of a particular brown cow with such focused intelligence that he found himself hoping the explanation would go on considerably longer than it did. He said none of this because he was a man with sense, and because they had a business arrangement, and because she had given him absolutely no indication that she thought of him as anything other than a useful partner in a commercial enterprise. Which was fine. He was useful. He would be the best partner she had ever had, and he would do it because the business was good and because the arrangement was fair. And if there was a part of him that was already looking for reasons to extend the partnership beyond its initial year, he could address that particular complication when it arrived. They spent the rest of that first day in practical matters. He brought his own cattle over the following week, handling the logistics with a quiet efficiency that Alberta admitted, privately and to no one, was impressive. His ranch hand, a compact and weathered man of about 50 named Devlin, helped with the move and then departed, leaving Abraham and Alberta to manage the pre-drive preparations with Alberta's single ranch hand, a young man of 22 named Claude who had been with the Langston family since he was 14, and who showed an immediate and transparent loyalty to Alberta that made Abraham feel, on occasion, studied. "Claude doesn't think much of me yet," Abraham said one evening, when Claude had gone off to check the fence line and left the two of them alone by the corral. Alberta was leaning on the fence rail, watching the combined herd settle in the evening light. The sky was going purple and gold along the western horizon, which was the kind of sky that made Texas look like something worth fighting for. "Claude is protective," she said. "Can't blame him," Abraham said. "He worries I'll get taken advantage of," she said, in a tone that suggested she found this simultaneously touching and irritating. "He's seen it happen to other women in this county. A widow or a woman on her own makes some kind of arrangement with a man and ends up with less than she started with. He's watched it. He's right to watch," Abraham said. "I've seen it too. It happens." She looked at him then, a sideways look under the brim of her hat. "You're very candid about the ways your own kind can be dishonest." "My own kind is people," he said. "Dishonesty isn't a male trait, it's a human one. But men in this country have more legal power than women, which means when a man is dishonest with a woman, the consequences tend to go in one direction." She turned back to the herd. "That's a reasonably thoughtful observation for a cattle rancher," she said. "I had a mother who taught school for 20 years, he said. She had opinions about power and law and who got to exercise which. She made sure I heard them." Alberta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," he said. "She passed 3 years ago. Pneumonia." He said it the way people in that era talked about loss matter-of-factly, because grief was something you carried in your pocket rather than displayed on your sleeve. "She would have liked this arrangement," he added. "She always said the best business was done between people who respected each other." "Does that mean you respect me?" Alberta said, and there was a lightness in her voice that she immediately seemed to consider and then permit. "I think you know I do," he said. She did not respond to that, but there was something in the angle of her chin and the slight change in the set of her shoulders that suggested she had heard it as more than a simple professional statement. Neither of them said anything more for a while, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that usually takes months of friendship to develop, which was strange and also, to Abraham at least, quite wonderful. The preparations for the cattle drive took the better part of 3 weeks. They needed to check and recheck the health of each animal, arrange their provisions, hire 2 additional trail hands for the drive, a pair of brothers from a neighboring county named Jerome and Emmett Hodge, who came recommended by the town's farrier as capable and honest, and coordinate their route. The drive north to Abilene was approximately 300 miles along what was by then a well-established route. Though the spring of 1878 had brought a dry wind from the southwest that was laying the grassland thin in places, which meant they would need to plan their water stops carefully. Abraham spread the map across the kitchen table of the Langston farmhouse one evening, and they spent 2 hours going over it together, Alberta contributing her knowledge of the creek crossings and seasonal water sources in the southern portion of the route, Abraham filling in the northern sections from his 2 previous drives. She had lit a lamp and set it between them, and in the warm yellow light she looked different than she did in the honest glare of the afternoon sun. Not softer exactly, Alberta Langston had a quality about her that made the words soft feel imprecise, but more present somehow, as if the lamp allowed details to emerge that the daylight flattened. The freckles across her nose and cheekbones, the way her lower lip was slightly fuller than the upper, the small scar along her left jaw that she had told him when he had asked, came from a childhood encounter with a fence post that she had not been paying enough attention to avoid. "Here," she said, pointing to a spot on the map about 80 miles north of Calhoun Creek. "There's a spring-fed pond just off the main trail, east about a quarter mile. My father used it on his drives. The grass around it is usually good. I know the spot," he said, "or close to it. There's a rancher named Porter who owns the land around it. He charged me $1 per 50 head on my last drive." "$1 per 50 seems fair," she said. "He's a fair man," Abraham agreed. "I'll write ahead and let him know we're coming." She nodded and they went on with the map, their heads bent over it together in the lamplight, their voices low and practical, and if either of them was aware of the warmth of the other's proximity, they were being very careful not to let on. The morning they left, Calhoun Creek turned out to watch them go. Not the whole town, but enough of it. The hardware merchant standing on his porch, a group of women from the church that Alberta had attended since childhood, the sheriff's deputy leaning against a post at the edge of Main Street. There was something in the way people watched that spoke to what a cattle drive still meant in 1878. A thing of scale and consequence, a deliberate pushing of living creatures across hundreds of miles of difficult country, the whole enterprise balanced on weather and grass, and the collective health of nearly 300 animals. Alberta rode at the head of the herd alongside Abraham. Claude and the Hodge brothers worked the flanks and the drag, keeping the cattle moving with practiced shouts and the occasional crack of a rope against a boot. The lead steers took to the trail with the reluctant cooperation of animals who had done this before and knew that resistance was ultimately futile. The first day was the hardest, because the first day always was. Cattle leaving familiar pasture are disagreeable and unpredictable, and by noon they had dealt with 2 attempted breaks by animals determined to return home, one of which had required Abraham and Jerome Hodge to ride hard for 20 minutes to cut off and turn back. Alberta had managed the rest of the herd during that time with Claude, keeping them moving steadily north, and when Abraham returned dusty and slightly out of breath, he found her already addressing the issue that had caused the break, a nervous young heifer at the edge of the herd, by riding alongside the animal and speaking to it in a low, calm voice until it settled. "That's a gift," he said, falling in beside her as they continued north. "My father taught me," she said. He said cattle were like most things, they responded to a calm voice better than a loud one. "Smart man," Abraham said. "In the ways that mattered most," she said. They made 15 miles that first day, which was reasonable given the circumstances, and set up camp in the late afternoon beside a shallow tributary of the Sweetwater that had enough water and enough grass to keep the herd comfortable overnight. The Hodge brothers handled the night watches, and Claude made coffee and a supper of beans and dried beef and cornbread that was considerably better than the circumstances warranted. Alberta sat by the fire after supper, her boots off and her feet stretched toward the warmth, going over the day's numbers in a small ledger she carried in her saddlebag. She tracked everything: distance covered, grass quality, water availability, the condition of individual animals she had noted during the day. Abraham came and sat a few feet away, close enough for conversation and far enough for propriety, and said nothing for a while, which she appreciated. 712 miles of trail behind me, he said eventually, looking at the fire. And I'm still not tired of seeing a herd move at dusk. She looked up from her ledger. The herd was visible in the fading light, settled and quiet, the dark shapes of the cattle blending into the grassland. "What is it that you like about it?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, the way she was coming to understand he considered most things. "It's purposeful," he said. "Everything has a reason. Where you're going, what you need, what the animals need, what the weather requires of you. There's no part of it that's wasted." "I feel that way about the ranch," she said, "or what the ranch could be." "What do you want it to be?" he said. "In 5 years, say." The question was a simple one, but no one had asked it of her since her father died, and the fact that someone was asking it now, a specific someone, made it feel more freighted with meaning than it strictly ought to have. "I want it to be a breeding operation," she said. "Not just trailing existing cattle to market. I want to develop stock. I've been reading about the Hereford crossbreeding that's happening further east. The animals are better suited to changing conditions, better at putting on weight. I want to be part of where the industry is going rather than where it has been." "That's a long-view strategy," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it. "It's the only strategy that makes sense on limited land," she said. 4,000 acres is enough for a good breeding operation. It's not enough to be a trail-driving enterprise indefinitely. "You've thought this through thoroughly," he said. "I have thought of very little else for the past 5 months," she said. They looked at each other across the firelight, and something passed between them that was either a shared understanding about cattle ranching strategy or something else entirely, and neither of them was fully prepared to name it. "I want the same thing for my operation," he said. "The Herefords I have are an experiment, but it's an experiment I believe in. Then we may want to revisit our partnership terms at the end of the year," she said, and it came out more like an invitation than a business proposition, and she heard it as soon as it left her lips and looked back down at her ledger. "I'd welcome that," he said quietly. The drive north took 12 days in total, with 2 days of rest for the herd built into the middle at the Porter Ranch, where the rancher showed up in person to collect his fee and stayed for supper, apparently delighted by the company. He was a garrulous and friendly man of about 60 who called Alberta ma'am, with genuine respect, and told Abraham, loudly and without embarrassment, that his partner was the most sensible-sounding rancher he had talked to in a decade. "Most of these trail operations," Porter said, waving his fork for emphasis at the camp supper table, "they think the answer is just more cattle, more miles, more of the same thing. You ask them what they want in 10 years and they look at you like you asked them to define philosophy. But you," he pointed the fork at Alberta, "you know where you're going." "She knows where she's going," Abraham said, with a simplicity and conviction that made Alberta look at him briefly and then look away. The grassland north of Porter's ranch gave way to the particular landscape of central Texas, rolling and vast, with the sky an enormous presence overhead that made you feel simultaneously small and significant. The herd moved steadily through it, and the rhythm of the drive began to settle into Alberta's blood in a way she had not expected. She had made drives with her father, but she had been younger then and had not been responsible for the whole enterprise. Now she was, and the weight of that responsibility was not a burden exactly. It was more like a ballast. It kept her centered. She and Abraham fell into an easy working partnership that the Hodge brothers and Claude seemed to regard with varying degrees of philosophical acceptance. Jerome Hodge, who was 30 and the more talkative of the two brothers, told Alberta on the 4th day of the drive that he had never worked with a woman rancher before and had expected it to be unusual, but had found it to be surprisingly ordinary, which Alberta accepted as the compliment it was genuinely intended to be. The cattle drive had its difficulties. A day of wind and rain that moved the herd skittish and required everyone on horseback for 6 straight hours. A section of trail where the grass had been grazed thin by a previous drive, and they had to range further east to find adequate feed. One of the longhorn steers developing a lame foot that they had to manage carefully for the final 3 days to avoid losing the animal entirely. But they came through all of it, and on the 12th day, with the Abilene stockyards visible on the horizon, Alberta rode alongside Abraham and felt something she had not felt in months. A clean, uncomplicated satisfaction that was very close to joy. "We made it," she said. "We did," he said, and he smiled at her, a full and unguarded smile that she filed away in a place she had not intended to open. The sale at Abilene went well. The market was strong for longhorns. That spring railroad expansion had driven beef prices up, and buyers were competing for good stock. The herd sold at $19.40 per head, which was better than Alberta's conservative estimate, and after expenses, their combined net came to a little over $6,000. Claude and the Hodge brothers each received their agreed wages plus a bonus that Abraham suggested, and Alberta seconded without hesitation. They settled accounts at the stockyard office, with Alberta doing most of the arithmetic and Abraham reviewing her numbers and confirming them, and then they walked out into the Abilene afternoon with the settlement papers and a bank draft that represented more money than Alberta had seen in a single transaction in her life. "60% of that is yours," Abraham said, when they were standing on the sidewalk outside the stockyard office. "I know what 60% is," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I just want to say it plainly. You've earned every cent of it." She looked at him. She was very good, usually, at not letting things show on her face. It was a skill she had developed from necessity, because a woman running a ranch in the Texas of 1878 could not afford to appear uncertain or emotional in business settings, as the world was waiting for exactly that evidence to use against her. But something in the directness of what he had said, and the straightforwardness with which he had said it, made it difficult to maintain her usual composure entirely. "Thank you," she said, "for the partnership. You've honored every term." "So have you," he said, "every single one." They ate supper that evening at a decent restaurant in Abilene that was neither the best in town nor the cheapest, which felt like the right register for a business celebration. Claude and Jerome and Emmett ate at another establishment nearby, and gave the two of them the privacy of the evening without being asked, which spoke to a collective understanding of the situation that was, perhaps, more perceptive than either Abraham or Alberta had credited them with. Over supper, with the drive behind them and the immediate financial pressure on the Langston ranch significantly relieved, the conversation moved away from cattle and figures and trail logistics and into the slightly more uncertain territory of personal history. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher mother and a father who had worked the river trade before it declined, and then turned to farming without a great deal of conviction. He talked about coming west at 22, working as a trail hand for other men's operations, before he had saved enough to start acquiring his own land. He talked about Texas without the reverence that some men brought to it. He liked it. He respected it. He thought it was possible to build something real there if you were willing to work in alignment with the country rather than in opposition to it. She told him about growing up on the Langston Ranch, which was the only home she had ever known. Her mother had died when Alberta was 9, of complications that were never fully explained to her at the time, and that she had only come to understand as an adult. Her father had raised her alone after that, with the help of a series of women from town who had come out to help manage the household, and who had each, in their own way, contributed something to who Alberta had become. She had learned to ride before she could read. She had learned to read voraciously once she started, working her way through every book in the county lending library and her father's small personal collection, and the occasional newspaper that came through with enough frequency to be useful. "You're self-educated then," he said. "Largely," she said. which I think is both a strength and a limitation. I have read a great deal about what I want to do with the ranch, agricultural journals, breeding manuals, books about land management, but there's no substitute for the knowledge that comes from having done a thing. You could have fooled me, he said. On this drive, you made decisions that more experienced hands would have gotten wrong. The heifer on the first day. The way you managed the water rationing during the rain. You read the herd like someone who has been doing it for decades. I have been doing it for decades, she said. I've been on this land my whole life. I've just never been solely responsible for it before. And how does it feel, he said, being solely responsible? She thought about that for a moment. Frightening, she said. And also she paused, searching for the right word, like standing in the exact right place. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, he said. The ride home from Abilene took 4 days on horseback, just the two of them and Claude, with Jerome and Emmett having parted ways at Abilene to return to their own county. They rode through the warming Texas landscape at a pace that was considerably more relaxed than the urgent push of the drive. And in that relaxation, something shifted between Alberta and Abraham in a way that was both entirely gradual and, in retrospect, completely inevitable. On the second day of the ride home, they stopped at midday near a live oak grove beside a clear-running creek to water the horses and eat from their provisions. Claude, with his apparently endless social intelligence, found something that needed attending to downstream and went to attend to it, leaving them alone in the dappled shade of the oaks. Alberta was sitting on a flat rock near the water's edge, taking off her boots to let her feet cool in the creek, when Abraham sat down on the bank nearby and said, without any particular preamble, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," she said. "I'll decide whether to answer." "Fair," he said. "Has there been anyone since your father?" "Has anyone been," he seemed to be choosing his words carefully, "important to you?" She was quiet for a moment, her feet in the cool water, looking at the light on the creek. "There was someone," she said. "A man named Garrett who worked for my father for a few years. We were close for a time, but he left when my father's fortunes declined. He said he needed something more established." She said it without particular bitterness, the way you talked about weather as something that had happened and that you had survived, and that had shaped the landscape without requiring you to be angry at it. After that, there was no one who seemed worth the complication. Until now. He said, and his voice was so quiet that she was not entirely sure she had heard him correctly, except that the words hung in the air with the absolute clarity of something that had been said exactly as intended. She looked at him. He was watching her with those storm-gray eyes that had been careful and now were not, that were open and direct, and a little uncertain in the way that only honest people are uncertain, because dishonest people never show their uncertainty. "Abraham," she said. "I know," he said. "I know we have a contract. I know this is a business arrangement. I know you wrote those terms specifically because you wanted this to be uncomplicated. And I have no intention of making it complicated if that's not what you want. But I also think you should know that somewhere between the first day of that drive and right now, I have stopped thinking of you only as a business partner." She looked at him for a long moment. The creek moved over the stones behind her with a sound like a low, continuous conversation. Somewhere in the oaks above them, a bird was singing something brief and bright. "You agreed to every term," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite amusement and not quite warmth but was made of both. "I did," he said, "and I meant every agreement. I am a man of my word. That hasn't changed." He paused. "But falling in love with you wasn't in the contract, and I can't seem to help it." The word love sat between them in the afternoon air with a weight and a realness that neither of them moved to diminish. Alberta's expression had gone through several variations in the past 30 seconds: calculation, caution, something that flickered across her face and was gone before it could be fully identified, and finally something that was quiet and clear and very steady. "You have very poor timing," she said. "I know," he said. "We're in the middle of a business partnership. I know that too. And you said it yourself. I wrote those terms specifically because I wanted this to be uncomplicated." "You did," he said, "and I'll abide by whatever you decide. I could not say it. It seemed dishonest not to." She pulled her feet from the creek and turned so she was looking at him fully, and she studied him with the same deliberate attention she brought to maps and livestock and soil surveys, not cold assessment but genuine, serious consideration. "How long?" she said. "How long what? How long have you known this about yourself?" He thought about it honestly. "The morning we shook hands at the Silver Spur," he said. "When you pushed that contract across the table and looked at me like you were prepared to argue every single point and weren't going to lose any of them. I thought I had never seen anyone more extraordinary in my life." He looked faintly embarrassed by this admission, in the way that genuinely honest people are embarrassed by their own honesty when it gets specific. "But I told myself it was just admiration, professional respect. And now," she said, "and now I've spent 3 weeks watching you manage a cattle drive with intelligence and humor and grace," he said. "And I've sat next to you at campfires and talked about things that matter, and I've watched you stand up to buyers in Abilene who thought they could undercut you because you were a woman, and I know that it's not just admiration." She was quiet for a long moment. Claude's footsteps were audible downstream, moving closer. She looked at the creek and then at the oaks and then at Abraham, and she made the kind of decision that she made the way she made all important decisions, not impulsively and not without acknowledgement of risk, but with full recognition that refusing to make a decision was also a decision and not always the safer one. "I think," she said carefully, "that you should give me some time to think about what you've said." "Of course," he said immediately. "And I think you should know," she said, just as carefully, "that I am not entirely without sympathy for the position you're in." It was the most restrained and qualified declaration of mutual feeling that had ever been made beside a central Texas creek, and it was also, somehow, everything. Abraham's expression changed in a way that was small and quiet and profound, and he said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying just then. Claude arrived back with the horses, looking carefully at the middle distance and asking no questions. They rode home. Back at the Langston ranch, life resumed its practical rhythms. There was always work to do, and work was a good thing to have when you were also doing the slow and careful work of figuring out what you were to each other. Alberta deposited her share of the drive proceeds at the Calhoun Creek Savings and Loan, paid down a significant portion of the outstanding loan, and had a conversation with the loan manager, a tight-faced man named Simmons, that went considerably more in her favor than their previous conversations had. "The ranch is operational," she told Simmons, laying her settlement papers on his desk. "The herd is viable and the land is productive. I'd like to discuss restructuring the remaining debt over a longer term at a fixed rate." Simmons looked at the papers. He looked at them for a long time. He had, in previous conversations, spoken to Alberta in the particular register that certain men reserved for women in business settings, not quite dismissive, but perpetually conditional, as if her competence was always provisional pending further review. The settlement papers, with their clear figures and their Abilene stockyard documentation, seemed to recalibrate something. "That can likely be arranged," he said. "I thought it could," she said. She walked out of the bank into the Calhoun Creek morning feeling, for the first time since her father's death, that the ground beneath her feet was genuinely hers. The months of summer came in with a heat that turned the grassland gold and put the whole county in an ongoing negotiation with its water sources. At the Langston Ranch, this came to a head when the well dropped to a point that was no longer adequate for a combined herd of anything approaching their planned breeding operation size. Abraham came one morning and stood by the well, dropping a stone and counting the seconds, and then looked at Alberta with the expression of a man about to make an argument. "We need to sink a new well," he said, "deeper. There's water down there. I told you about the geological survey." "I know there's water," she said, "but drilling is expensive. We cleared the loan issue, but I don't have the capital for a deep well right now." "I do," he said. She looked at him. It's an investment in the partnership, he said carefully, using the professional language they still defaulted to in practical discussions. The water issue affects my cattle as much as yours. Let me put in the capital for the well and we can add it to the partnership accounts. We'd need to amend the contract, she said. Then let's amend the contract, he said. They sat at the kitchen table with the original contract and a fresh sheet of paper, and added a seventh term covering the well investment, which would be treated as a shared asset with repayment to Abraham from Alberta's share of future profits on a schedule they negotiated with the same precision they had brought to the original agreement. It was, objectively speaking, a very well-drafted amendment. And it was also, less objectively, an excuse to sit at the kitchen table together for 3 hours on a warm summer evening, occasionally disagreeing about specific wording, and then finding language they both liked, and drinking coffee that Alberta made at the wood stove, and that was significantly better than anything available at any establishment in Calhoun Creek. At one point, late in the evening, she brought fresh coffee to the table and set his cup down near his hand, and he said, without looking up from the paper, "Thank you, Alberta," and something in the way he said her name, the way people who are genuinely fond of someone say a name, with no formality or performance in it, made her stand still beside the table for just a moment too long. He looked up and found her looking at him, and the thing that had been sitting between them since the creek in the live oak grove on the ride home from Abilene was suddenly very present in the kitchen. "You said you needed time to think," he said. "I did," she said. "Have you had enough time?" She set her own coffee cup down and sat across from him, folding her hands on the table in a way that was either composed or was doing an excellent impression of it. "I have thought about it," she said, "considerably." And he said, "And I think," she said slowly, "that you should know that the reason I needed time was not because I was uncertain about my feelings. It was because I was uncertain about whether it was wise to act on them." "What conclusion did you reach?" he said. "That wisdom and happiness are not always the same project," she said, "and that I have been very devoted to wisdom for a very long time, and it has served me well, and I intend to keep being wise, but that perhaps it is possible to be wise and also to let someone care about you," he said. She looked at him across the amended contract and the coffee cups and the lamplight. "Yes," she said, "that." He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, very gently, the way a person touches something they consider valuable and fragile. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over so that their palms met, and she looked at their joined hands on the table for a moment, and then she looked at him, and what was in her face was the thing she had been holding carefully arranged and contained for months, now present and full and unambiguous. "I think you should know," she said, "that somewhere between Abilene and home, I stopped thinking of you only as a business partner, too." He smiled at her, that full, unguarded smile that she had catalogued and kept safe, and said, "The contract doesn't cover this." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't. We'll have to negotiate." "I think," she said, with a warmth in her voice that she did not bother to moderate, "that we have gotten quite good at that." The well they drilled that summer went down 68 feet and struck an abundant aquifer that the geologist from the county seat called one of the best sources he had seen in the region. When the first clean, cold water came up through the new pump, and Alberta turned the handle and watched it fill the trough, she laughed, a real laugh, uncomplicated and full, and Abraham, who was standing nearby, thought it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his life. Claude, who witnessed this, went to check the fence line with the stoic contentment of a man who has concluded that things are working out approximately as they should. The summer and autumn of 1878 brought them further and closer in the way that shared work and shared purpose has of doing when the people involved are paying honest attention to each other. He came to the ranch most days. There was always legitimate reason, always actual work to do, and they did the work, and within the work they built something that was architecture and warmth simultaneously. He took her to supper at the decent restaurant in Calhoun Creek, twice, and both times they stayed far later than the meal required and walked home slowly through the autumn evening air. And on the second occasion, he took her hand as they walked and she let him. And they walked through the Texas night holding hands like two people who had found each other in the place where they were supposed to be. He kissed her for the first time standing by the corral at the end of an October evening, with the sun going down behind the hills and the herd quiet and settled in the pasture and the air smelling of grass and distance. She had said something that made him laugh, and then she had looked at him while he was laughing, and he had stopped laughing and looked back, and then it was simply a matter of the small distance between them being covered, which it was, with great care and intention on his part and great clarity on hers. It was not a long kiss, but it was a definitive one, in the way that first kisses between people who have been circling each other with honesty and patience tend to be. When it was over, she stood very still for a moment, looking at him with an expression he could not quite read, and then she said, "I should have put a clause in the contract about this." "What would it have said?" he asked. She considered. "That it should happen sooner," she said. He laughed again, and so did she, and then they stood together in the October evening with the wide Texas sky overhead, and it was a remarkably good moment. The town of Calhoun Creek noticed, as small towns do, though it said relatively little in public, as small towns also learn to do when they are wise. There was some comment, not all of it kind, because the injustice of it was that a woman who conducted herself with complete propriety and managed her own affairs with intelligence and success was still subject to a particular kind of scrutiny that her male counterpart was not. But Alberta was not a woman who allowed other people's commentary to alter her course, and Abraham was not a man who pretended it wasn't happening or dismissed it as unimportant. "They're talking," she said to him one afternoon with a pragmatic rather than a wounded tone. "Let them," he said. "It doesn't bother you," she said. "It bothers me on your behalf," he said. "It infuriates me, actually, that you can build something from nothing and the conversation is still about whether your personal life is appropriate. But no, it doesn't change anything I intend to do. Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "It used to," she said. "When I was younger, I spent a great deal of energy trying to manage what people thought. Now I find that the energy is better spent on the actual thing." She looked at him. "The actual thing being considerably more worth my attention." "I'm glad to hear I'm worth your attention," he said. "Don't be smug about it," she said. "It doesn't suit you." "Absolutely," he said. "I'll work on that." She shook her head, but she was smiling. October became November, and the partnership terms came to the end of their first year in good standing. On the actual anniversary of the day they had shaken hands at the Silver Spur Saloon, they sat at the kitchen table, which had become, over the course of the year, a kind of headquarters for every important conversation they had, and discussed renewal. Alberta had a new version of the contract ready. It was significantly more detailed than the original, accounting for the well investment, the planned purchase of additional Hereford stock, the second planned drive in the coming spring, and a number of operational changes she had been thinking about. She pushed it across the table to him. He read it with the same careful attention he had brought to the original, but his expression was different now, not a stranger evaluating a proposal, but a man reading a document written by someone whose thinking he knew well and trusted completely. "There's one thing missing," he said. She frowned slightly. "What did I miss?" He reached into the pocket of his canvas shirt and set something on the table in front of her. It was a ring, simple and honest, a gold band with a small turquoise stone that was the same particular shifting shade as the Texas sky on a clear morning. It was not extravagant. It was not trying to be anything other than what it was. "You missed the part," he said, "where we stop having a business arrangement and start having a marriage." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside, through the window, the November afternoon light was going amber and long across the grass. Alberta looked at the ring. She looked at him. She had the expression she got when she was working through the implications of something complex, careful, and systematic, except that this time the calculation was very brief, because she realized, been doing this particular calculation for months without acknowledging to herself that she was doing it, and all the variables were already accounted for. "Abraham Lawson," she said. "Alberta Langston," he said. "Are you proposing to me at a business negotiation?" she said. "I'm proposing to you at the same table where we have done most of our important talking," he said. It seemed appropriate. She looked at the ring again. She picked it up carefully. It was warm from his pocket. She turned it in her fingers and looked at the turquoise, which was exactly the color she would have chosen if anyone had thought to ask her. "My name," she said. "I want to keep my name." He had not expected that, but he responded to it without hesitation. "Langston Lawson," he said, "if that works for both of us." "Alberta Langston Lawson," she said, trying it. "Or just Alberta Langston," he said. "I'm not keeping score on names. I'm asking you to share your life with me. The name is yours. It always will be." She set the ring on the table between them and looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." He was very still for a second. "Yes. Yes, Abraham, I'm saying yes." He took the ring and took her left hand and slid it onto her finger, and it fit with the simple accuracy of a thing that was meant to be there. And then he stood up from his chair and came around the table, and she stood too. And he put his arms around her and held her with the kind of care that is the physical expression of everything that has been thought and felt and held carefully for months. And she put her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, which was something she had not let herself do in a very long time. "I should put a clause in the contract about this," he said, into her hair. She laughed, the same unguarded laugh that she had laughed at the new well in August, and he held her tighter, because it was still his favorite sound. They married in January of 1879 at the small white church in Calhoun Creek, with Claude serving as the witness for Alberta's side and Abraham's friend and neighbor, a rancher named Whitfield who had ridden 2 days to be there serving for Abraham's. The ceremony was brief and honest, which suited both of them. The minister said the words and they said their words, and then they were married. The congregation at the church, which included most of the people who had watched and commented and speculated through the preceding year, seemed to have arrived at a collective conclusion that this was a good thing, and that they had perhaps always thought so. The women from Alberta's church circle brought food to the small reception held at the ranch afterward, and the town's hardware merchant, who had watched them leave on the drive the previous April, came and shook Abraham's hand and told Alberta that her father would have been proud. "He would have liked you," Alberta said to Abraham, later that evening, when everyone had gone and the ranch was quiet and theirs. "Tell me something he would have said," Abraham said. She thought about it. "He would have asked you whether you could mend a fence post," she said. "He thought that was the most reliable indicator of a man's character." "And can I?" "You built 3 new ones last month," she said. "I think you'd have passed." "Good," he said. "I always want to pass the important tests." She took his hand. "You passed them months ago," she said. The winter of 1879 was a working winter. There were always things to do, and they did them together with the ease that genuine partnership creates. The ranch took on more hands, including a young woman named Rosaria, who came from a family 2 counties over, and turned out to be extraordinarily gifted with horses. Abraham's Hereford breeding experiment began to produce results that were even more promising than he had hoped, and Alberta spent considerable time corresponding with an agricultural college in the East about soil management techniques that she then adapted for their specific acreage. Claude, who had started as Alberta's single ranch hand, and who had watched the whole improbable year unfold with protective attention, announced in February that he intended to use his wages and bonus from the previous year to lease a small piece of land north of town and try a few head of cattle on his own account. Alberta nearly cried, and then didn't, and then told him that she fully expected he would succeed and that she intended to help him find good stock. "You've been family to this ranch," she told him. "You've been family to me," he said, with the uncomplicated directness of a man who was not given to speeches. She gave him 2 of the better yearling steers from the breeding herd as a starting gift. He tried to refuse them, and she told him not to be foolish, and he accepted them with the grace of someone who knows when arguing is futile and also unnecessary. The second cattle drive, in the spring of 1879, was a larger and more sophisticated operation than the first. They had 140 head of their combined stock to trail, a team of 4 capable hands, and the benefit of having done it once before as partners. They made the drive in 10 days, sold at $21 per head in a strong Abilene market, and came home with enough to make the final payment on the original Langston Ranch loan, and to purchase the additional breeding stock Alberta had been planning since before she had first walked into the Silver Spur Saloon. The day she made the final payment to Simmons at the savings and loan, she did not make a scene about it, because she was not a woman who made scenes. But she walked out of that building into the Calhoun Creek afternoon and stood for a moment in the sunshine with her face tilted up slightly, and Abraham, who had come with her and who had waited outside, watched her and understood exactly what she was feeling without needing to be told. "It's yours," he said when she opened her eyes and looked at him. "It's ours," she said. "Yours first," he said. "That matters." She took his arm and they walked down the main street of Calhoun Creek together in the April sunshine, past the hardware merchant and the church and the Silver Spur Saloon. And she thought about the morning she had walked into that saloon with a handwritten contract and an audacious proposal and not quite enough hope. And she thought about how different everything looked now. Not the town, which was essentially unchanged, but the landscape of her own life, which had been remade by a year of work and honesty, and a man who had agreed to every single term of her arrangement, and then had the audacity to fall in love with her. She tightened her arm slightly in his, and he looked at her sideways with a smile, and they walked on. In the summer of 1879, Alberta began to suspect, and then confirmed what she then told Abraham on a Wednesday evening in July, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee between them. She told him plainly, watching his face, which went through several rapid expressions: surprise, calculation, something that was not quite ready to be named, and then something that settled into a fullness that was unmistakable and complete. "A baby," he said. "In February," she said. "Approximately." He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had only seen once or twice before, the way they went when he was genuinely moved by something and was not trying to manage it. "Alberta," he said. "Abraham," she said, with a gentleness in her voice that she reserved entirely for him. How do you feel?" he said. "Well," she said. "Somewhat tired, but well." "We'll need to think about— I have already thought about it," she said, which made him laugh. "Of course you have," he said. "Tell me your plan." "We'll need to hire another hand to cover the work I won't be doing in the final months," she said. "Rosaria can take on more of the horse management. You'll need to be in communication with the Abilene buyers about next spring's drive early, because I want everything arranged well in advance." She paused. "And we should write to your sister in Missouri. I know you've been meaning to introduce us, and this seems like good reason." He had a sister, Miriam, who was 28 and who Abraham had spoken of with the particular warmth of someone who genuinely liked their sibling. Alberta had not yet met her, though they had exchanged 1 or 2 letters after the marriage. "Miriam would love this," he said. "I hope so," she said, "because I intend to invite her to come and stay." He shook his head, slowly and fondly. "You've planned this entirely," he said. "I've planned the parts that can be planned," she said. "The rest," she spread her hands in a small gesture that for her was practically theatrical, "we'll manage as it comes." "We always do," he said. Miriam Lawson arrived from Missouri in September, a tall and quick-minded woman who shook Alberta's hand with genuine enthusiasm and immediately proved to be both a practical help and excellent company. She had never been to Texas before and found it large and overwhelming and extraordinary, and she said so with a directness that Alberta found very familiar. "You're like your brother," Alberta told her one afternoon when they were sitting on the porch watching the sun go down behind the pasture. "He says the same thing," Miriam said. "I think he means it as a compliment." "So do I," Alberta said. Miriam stayed through the winter, which was a thing that benefited everyone. She was there in February of 1880, on a cold, clear night when the stars were enormous overhead, when Abraham paced the yard outside the farmhouse with the focused anxiety of a man who is trying to be useful and has temporarily run out of useful things to do, and when the midwife and Miriam were inside, and when, a little before midnight, the sound of a baby's first strong cry came through the farmhouse window and stopped Abraham in his tracks. The midwife opened the door and looked at him. "A boy," she said, "healthy and large. Your wife would like to see you." He went inside. Alberta was in bed, tired in the specific and profound way of someone who has just done the most demanding physical work of their life, and she had a baby in her arms, a red-faced, emphatically present baby boy. And when she looked up and saw Abraham in the doorway, her expression was everything that could not possibly be adequately described in words, and that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He sat on the edge of the bed and she shifted the baby so that he could see, and then, because he asked and because she was perfectly steady, he held his son for the first time. "He's very large," he said, with a kind of wondering respect. "I know," she said, with less wonder and more commentary on the fact of having been responsible for that largeness for 9 months. He laughed very quietly so as not to startle the baby. "What do you want to name him?" "Henry," she said. "After my father." "Henry," he said, testing it. The baby, who was not old enough to have opinions about names but had opinions about everything else, made a small sound of uncertain engagement. "Henry Lawson Langston." "Henry James Lawson Langston," she said. "James was your father's name." He looked at her. She met his look calmly, in the way she did most things, but there was a tenderness in it that she did not try to moderate or contain. "How did you know his name?" he said. "Miriam told me," she said. "Last month I asked her." He looked down at Henry James Lawson Langston, who was approximately 40 minutes old and already seemed to have inherited his mother's quality of taking up exactly the right amount of space. "He would have liked that," Abraham said. "Good," she said. "Then it's settled." The spring of 1880 was full to the edges. Miriam, who had ostensibly come for a visit and had clearly decided that visit was an ongoing condition, helped manage the household in the weeks after Henry's birth, which allowed Alberta to recover properly, and then to return to the ranch work at her own pace and on her own terms. She was back in the saddle within 6 weeks, which the midwife said was too soon, and Alberta said was perfectly timed, and which was, in fact, fine, because Alberta Langston Lawson knew her own body with the same thorough attention she brought to everything else she cared about. The breeding operation was growing in a way that justified every plan she had laid out in that original contract, and several that she had added since. Their Hereford crosses were producing animals that attracted interest from other ranchers in the county, and by midsummer of 1880 they were selling breeding stock directly, which carried better margins than trail driving, to 3 neighboring operations. Miriam, during this period, met and became interested in the county's new school teacher, a quiet and earnest man named Caldwell, which delighted Alberta and pleased Abraham and produced a great deal of dignified correspondence that Miriam conducted at the kitchen table in the evenings while Abraham and Alberta went over accounts beside her, and Henry slept in the cradle that Abraham had built over the winter with the same painstaking attention he brought to fence posts and well drilling. The cradle was excellent. Alberta had told him so when he presented it, and he had said that Henry deserved good workmanship, and she had said that everything they built together deserved good workmanship, and it was one of those small conversations that meant much more than it appeared to. By the end of 1880, the Langston Lawson Ranch, which was what everyone in Calhoun Creek had started calling it, the official name on the deed being simply the Langston Ranch, but the community understanding, being considerably more accurate than the paperwork, was operating at a scale that Alberta had described in the kitchen, in lamplight, to a business partner she had not yet loved. The well was producing abundantly. The herd was healthy and growing through careful breeding rather than reckless expansion. The land was being managed in a way that the county agricultural agent described, in a report that Alberta kept in her desk drawer, as exemplary. In the late autumn of 1880, they sat together on the porch of the farmhouse in the evening, Henry on a blanket at their feet, showing a robust interest in a wooden horse toy that Abraham had carved, and Alberta looked out at the pasture and the herd and the land that went to the horizon in every direction and said, very quietly, "We did it. We did," he said. "Everything I said I wanted at that table in the Silver Spur. The breeding operation, the water. The loan paid off, the land operational." She paused. "And more." "More," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she had started doing in the months after the wedding and which had become as natural as breathing. He put his arm around her, and they watched the Texas evening come in over their land, which was golden and vast and entirely theirs. "You know," she said, "when I wrote that contract, I was genuinely not thinking about you as anything except a solution to a practical problem." "I know," he said. "And then I sat across from you and you read every term carefully and agreed to the ones you agreed with and amended the one you didn't, and I thought—" She paused, seeming to search for the right description. "What?" he said. "I thought that whoever ends up with this man will be very fortunate," she said. "And then I thought that was an inappropriate thought to have at a business negotiation." "But accurate," he said. "Extremely accurate," she said. He pressed his lips to her hair very gently. "I thought the same kind of thing," he said. "Standing at your pasture fence looking at your cattle, I thought, whoever ends up with this woman will have to be paying full attention for the rest of their life, and there is no version of that which is not wonderful." Henry, who was 11 months old and had no patience for extended sentimental reflection when there was a wooden horse to be concerned with, said something emphatically in the universal language of babies who have decided they want to be picked up. Alberta laughed and reached down for him, settling him in her lap with the practiced ease of nearly a year of motherhood, and Henry immediately reached for the button on her collar with the focused determination of a person who has important work to do. Abraham watched them, his wife, his son, the land behind them going to gold in the autumn light, and felt the particular quality of happiness that comes not from any single moment, but from the accumulation of a life that has been built deliberately and with care. Miriam married Caldwell the following spring, in the same white church in Calhoun Creek, and after a short honeymoon in San Antonio, she and her husband settled a mile outside of town, where Caldwell continued to teach school, and Miriam became involved in the town library, which suited everyone perfectly. Claude's small operation north of town was doing well. He had expanded from the 2 starting steers to a modest herd of 12 and had leased additional grazing land. He came to the Lawson ranch for Sunday supper with some regularity, and was clearly thriving in the particular way of a person who has found exactly the scale of endeavor that suits them. In the spring of 1881, Alberta told Abraham at the kitchen table that Henry was going to have a sibling. He looked up from the accounts he was reviewing. "When?" "October," she said. He put the accounts down. "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said, "this time feels different from the first, calmer somehow." "You've done it before," he said. "You know what to expect." "I know approximately what to expect," she said. "The specifics always reserve the right to surprise you." He reached across the table and took her hand. "We'll manage," he said. "We always do," she said. In October of 1881, their daughter was born, a smaller and more immediately opinionated baby than Henry had been, with Alberta's particular shade of auburn hair and Abraham's storm-gray eyes, a combination that both her parents found extraordinary. They named her Frances Ruth Lawson Langston, Frances for Abraham's mother, Ruth for a beloved aunt of Alberta's who had passed years before. Henry, now nearly 2 years old, regarded his sister with the cautious diplomacy of a child who has been told something good is coming, and is reserving judgment on the delivery. Within 2 weeks, he had decided she was acceptable and took to sitting beside her cradle and providing a running commentary on events that she was as yet unequipped to appreciate. The ranch continued to grow and deepen in the way that a well-managed operation does when the people running it understand both the land and each other. They hired 2 more permanent hands over the following 2 years. A middle-aged man named Garrett Peters who had considerable experience with cattle medicine and who proved invaluable during a difficult autumn when a respiratory illness moved through the county's herds, and a young man of 20 named Thomas who was ambitious and quick-learning, and who Alberta mentored with a patience and investment that spoke to the person her father had made her. The business arrangement, which they still occasionally called it in moments of private humor, had long since become something that could not be adequately described by any contract they had ever written. But the contracts themselves, the original, the amendment, the various partnership documents they had added over the years sat in a wooden box in Alberta's desk drawer, and occasionally she took them out and read them. She did this one evening in the late autumn of 1882, when Abraham had taken Henry and Frances to see a neighbor's new foal, and the house was quiet, and she sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and unfolded the original document in its slightly yellowed paper, and read it in its entirety. Every term was still in force, not because they were legally bound by a 1-year contract that had long since been renewed into something that bore no resemblance to its original form, but because the spirit of what had been written there, respect, equality, shared decision-making, clear accounting, mutual benefit, had become simply the way they lived and worked and thought about their life together. She was folding the document back into its envelope when she heard the wagon coming into the yard, and Henry's voice excited about the foal, and Abraham's voice answering him, and Frances making the sound she made when she wanted to be put down and allowed to examine things on her own terms. She put the papers back in the drawer and went to the door. Abraham was lifting Frances from the wagon, and Henry was already jumping down from the other side and running toward the house with the energy of a child who has seen a foal and considers this information of urgent importance. He reached her at the door and grabbed her hand. "Mama, the foal has a white star on its nose," he said, "and it fell over twice, and then it stood up and it looked at me, and I think it liked me." "It sounds like it definitely liked you," she said. "Can we get one?" he said. "We have several horses, Henry." "A foal," he said, "a baby one." "We'll talk about it," she said, which was the parental construction that Henry had not yet learned to interpret correctly, and she looked at Abraham over Henry's head, and he gave her the look that said he knew exactly what they had in common in terms of their feelings about a reasonable conversation about foals. He came up the porch steps with Frances in his arms, and Frances reached immediately for Alberta, who took her and settled her on her hip in the practiced way that had become as natural as walking. "Good evening," he said to her. "Good evening," she said. "The horses. Foal's healthy. Peters thinks the mother is a good producer. Then we should talk to them about breeding rights next season." "Already proposed it," he said. "They're interested." She nodded, satisfied, and moved to go back inside, and he stopped beside her in the doorway and pressed a brief kiss to her temple, and Frances made a small sound of commentary, and Henry was already inside asking about supper, and the evening light was long and golden across the pasture. "What did I do?" she said once to Abraham, a few months after Frances was born, when they were lying awake late and talking in the way they talked when the house was quiet and the children were asleep and there was no agenda, "to end up here." "You walked into the Silver Spur Saloon," he said, "with a piece of paper and a plan. And you agreed to every term," she said. "Every one," he said, "without reservation. And then you had the nerve to fall in love with me," she said. "I did," he said, "and I would do it again every time." She was quiet for a moment in the dark with the sound of Texas wind moving through the grass outside and the house breathing quietly around them. I would do it again too, she said. All of it, every term. He put his arm around her and she settled against him, and the night was still and wide and full. And outside on their land the cattle were settled in the pasture, and the new well was pulling cold water from deep in the earth where it had always been waiting. And the sky over Calhoun Creek, Texas, in the year 1883, was the particular shade of dark that holds all the stars. Alberta Lawson, who had walked into a saloon with a handwritten contract and the audacity of someone who refused to be defeated by an unfair world, and who had proposed a business arrangement that made perfect sense on every rational level, and who had sat across from a man with storm-gray eyes and a careful way of reading documents and making assessments, had ended up with something that no contract had ever been designed to capture. Something that had grown from a handshake and a shared cattle drive and a lamplit evening of amended terms into a life that was full and hard-won and entirely, completely hers. His too. Theirs. Henry grew up knowing the land the way his mother knew it, from the ground up, with attention and respect. Frances grew up asking questions about everything and expecting full answers, which anyone who knew her parents would have predicted without difficulty. The ranch passed from good to better in the particular way of places that are tended by people who love both the work and each other. And in Calhoun Creek, in the stories that people told about the place and its history, there was always the story of the woman who walked into the Silver Spur with a handwritten contract on a spring morning in 1878, and the man who read every term carefully and agreed to them all, and how the business arrangement that made perfect sense had turned into something that made even more sense. The kind that could not be written on paper but that showed, clear and lasting, in everything that had been built from it. The last cattle drive they made together, in the spring of 1884, was different from all the others, not because of anything that happened on it, but because they took Henry, who was 4 years old and who sat in front of his father on the horse for long stretches, and regarded the moving herd with an expression of intense and serious satisfaction that was so completely his mother's that Abraham had to look away and smile so that Henry wouldn't ask what was funny. At the end of that drive, settling the accounts in Abilene one more time, Alberta looked at the figures in her ledger, the accumulated total of 6 years of careful, deliberate, partnership-built work, and felt the satisfaction of a person who had said what she wanted and done what she said and come out the other side into something better than she had planned. She closed the ledger and looked at Abraham, who was watching her from across the stockyard office with Henry asleep against his shoulder and the afternoon sun coming through the window and making everything look the way she sometimes felt, warm and clear and fully, exactly real. "Ready to go home," he said. "Yes," she said, and they went.